Hi there. This video is going to talk a little bit about King David's son Solomon, King Solomon, and some other kings that appear in the Bible. So the books in the historical section of the Old Testament, 1 Kings and 2 Kings, describe rulers that follow David. Now in the Tanakh, so in the Jewish version of, what we would call the Old Testament, Samuel is one big book, Kings is one big book, and in the Greek translation of the Bible, both of these were artificially divided, and a Catholic Bible maintains those divisions. So 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and so even though 1 and 2 Kings are 2 different books in our Bible, they're telling one big story. And we're going to look a little later in class at, how we can kind of tell that that split was artificial. So 1 and 2 Kings begins by describing the reign of King Solomon, who was David and Bathsheba's son. And following Solomon's reign, the kingdom falls into civil war. And these stories end with the destruction of both nations and the beginning of the Babylonian exile. And we know that these books were written after 562 BC because that's the last event that's mentioned. It's the king being released from prison. So, for example, if a history textbook described the Civil War, it couldn't have been written in 1800 because the American Civil War happened after that. If a textbook discussed humans landing on the moon, it couldn't have been written in 1950 because the moon landing happened after that. If I showed you a history textbook that discussed 9/11, couldn't be my book from high school because I was in high school before then. So the release of Jehoiakim from prison dates to 562 BC. And we know that writers used earlier versions of the history that date to about 100 or 150 years before that. Okay, so during Solomon's reign, Israel is at peace. So David built this empire and made it very peaceful, and that continued during his son Solomon's reign. So the borders are very secure. They don't have enemies like the Philistines threatening them. They're able to trade with a lot of their neighbors. And Solomon is a very good king. So he's a good administrator, probably very wise, highly educated, and one of Solomon's great qualities is that he brings great wealth to Israel. So he builds a large palace and a temple in Jerusalem, and that legacy is, one of the lasting gifts that Solomon gives to the people of Israel. But those wonderful things like the palace and the temple come at a cost. And one of the biggest costs was that there was a huge difference between people who were rich and people who were poor. Now, Solomon built that palace and built that temple, but he used forced labor to do it. So, not quite slavery, but, say, for example, if you've ever seen the movie Mulan, when Mulan's dad has to go fight the Huns, that's a sort of forced labor situation. So families would have to send workers to go work on these projects. Part of the problem was that most of these workers came from the north of the country, but the palace, the temple, they were in the south. And think about that. If you were in the north, you had to leave your land, leave your family, go work on this project in the south, and people aren't going to come to the north to spend their money. They're going to come to the palace or come to the temple to see these amazing structures and spend all their money there. So you're leaving your own family and your own land to work on a project that's not really going to benefit you. So there was some resentment there. Solomon also engaged in summit marriages. So a summit marriage is when 2 people from different royal families get married and create an alliance between them. This happens all throughout history. That itself was not a problem. The problem was that Solomon's foreign wives brought their foreign gods with them. And to make his wives happy, Solomon would worship those gods, and that is a big problem. And Solomon's really just doing what other kings in the ancient world were doing, but those other kings didn't have a covenant with God. So it's kind of like if all the other kings in the ancient world jumped off a bridge, would Solomon? And the answer should have been no. Because in the ancient world, religion was not separate from the rest of life. So vocab word for you is syncretism, and that is when we try to blend different religious systems into one belief, and we don't really tell one apart from the other. And this happened in Israel pretty gradually, and started with things like farming. So for example, if you are an Israelite farmer and you see your pagan neighbor next to you has, crops that are doing really, really well, and you say, wow, how are your crops doing so great? And they say, oh, well, I pray to this particular God, and I do this dance and give this offering at this altar, and my crops go great. And so you think, wow, well, I'm an Israelite, I worship just Yahweh, but I'm going to try doing that dance that he did and, put an offering out in my field and just kind of see what happens. And so you end up blending those two traditions together. Now, Yahwists were people who did not like that policy of syncretism. They saw that as going against the covenant. And they said, you know what, people, you need to be loyal to only Yahweh. Blending those traditions at all is showing disloyalty to Yahweh. And things like forced labor and unequal distribution of wealth, those were matters of justice, because the covenant is with every person. God's chosen people equally. God didn't choose, some of the Israelites more than the others. And so prophets were people who called the Israelites back to faithfulness with Yahweh. And we will talk way more about prophets in the next unit. So Solomon had his faults, but was a pretty good king. His son Rehoboam, though, was not a good king. So Rehoboam was kind of, we'll say kind of a spoiled brat. And he sparked civil war. So what happens is the tribes come to him and they say, you know what, your dad was pretty hard on us, and if you would kind of lighten up a little bit, we'll be faithful to you. And so the advisors say, yep, that's what you should do. Go a little easier on them. He talks to his friends who say, no, be even tougher on them. And so he takes the advice of his friends and is even tougher on the people and sparks civil war. So 10 tribes, the people that belong to 10 of the northern tribes, rebel and form their own nation. And so now we have a divided Israel. In the north, we have the country of Israel. So people who would belong to 10 of those tribes, their capital is Samaria. So Samaritans come from the north, come from Israel, come from Samaria. That becomes really important later, because remember, in the New Testament, Jews and Samaritans do not get along. So the south was the country of Judah, approximately 2 tribes, and the capital of Jerusalem. And Judah is really where the Jews come from. So the seeds of kind of discontent between Jews and Samaritans are sown right here. And each of them, the north and the south, each accuse the other of violating the covenant. And so on this map, you can just kind of see the territory of the northern country of Israel and the southern country of Judah. The capitals are marked with the red dots. And you can kind of compare that to maps that in earlier videos that show you the territory of those different tribes. And so after Rehoboam, the books of 1 and 2 Kings describe the stories of kings. With very few exceptions, these 2 books, the stories of the kings, follow a very specific pattern. So the beginning of that pattern talks about, in what year that king reigned compared to the reign in the other kingdom, how old they were if they're a king of Judah, how long they reigned, what was their capital city, and if they were a king from Judah, who was their mom, and a theological evaluation. Were they a good king or a bad king? The key to whether they were a good king or a bad king was, did they follow Yahweh or did they not follow Yahweh? If they do what God wanted them to do, they were a good king. If they did not do what God wanted them to do, they were a bad king. The middle of a story really talks about anything noteworthy that happened in their reign, and the end of the story talks about other sources of information for learning about that king, how they died, where they were buried, and who succeeds them. So we will look at some stories of those kings in class. See you then.